Hello, Regina. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to have you on to talk about the East Coast Greenway. So we've already done a little intro. Tell us something about you or your ride that maybe wasn't a part of all that.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tim. I'm really excited about being on my first podcast. I am, like you probably mentioned already, I am a bike commuter turned bike packer, bike tourer, not really sure exactly what I would consider myself, but yeah, I rode the East Coast Greenway in 29 days and found out all the exciting things that happen when you try to ride 140 miles with 3 pounds of water on your back. So
Oh man.
lots of
I
fun stories to tell.
totally. And I want to make sure everybody knows, and I'm sure I mentioned it, that the video is there for folks to see the kind of cool compressed storytelling version of all that. And that's how I ended up discovering you and wanting very much to have you on the show. Okay, I want to start off by talking about bike packing versus bike touring, because I struggle with labels. I reject labels in some ways, but like where do you feel, it feels like that you're kind of like in this in between space. Tell me more about what you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I was doing initial research into bike packing and bike touring, and it seems like to me the biggest difference was the bike setup. It seemed like bike packers typically carry things less in panniers and more attached to their, like, minimally attached, or like there's something behind your seat, or there's like saddlebags and everything that's like as minimally put together as possible. And then bike tours carry a lot more things. I would consider myself somewhere in the middle because I had a pretty light setup, but still carried around panniers and stayed in hotels when I absolutely needed to.
Yeah, I feel like the hybrid is kind of a cool model, especially if you're doing a mix of pavement and trails.
Yeah.
And yeah, and panniers can be helpful,
Oh,
so
yeah.
I kind of do a little of both. I do the frame bags and I do panniers as well, but I also know that I think sometimes the bike packing purists would absolutely reject me saying anything I do is bike packing. So
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
cool with that too. I get that.
Me too.
Um, so you had a month to do a trip and you chose the East Coast Greenway. What made you choose the East Coast Greenway for your very aggressive, very completist take on a tour?
Yeah, yeah. So my personality is very intense when it comes to goals. When I decide I want to do something, I'm going to do the whole thing. And when I want to try something, I don't just dip my toes in. I dive in head first and then see whether I crash and hit the bottom or if it's a great time. So I had a month to do a trip because my work would let me take a max of 30 days before it became a leave of absence. So 30 days to do a trip. And I had just watched a video of Lael Wilcox biking the Tour Divide, which is one of the most inspirational videos I've ever seen. And I knew I wanted to do something like that, but not quite that, because I don't think that's a very approachable beginner bike trip. So I had some criteria. I wanted to do something long. I wanted to do something scenic. And then, unlike the Tour Divide, I wanted to do something that had a good amount of civilization and not too remote, so that if something were to happen, which many things did, I could call for help and not feel like I was completely alone. So my boyfriend had ridden a portion of the East Coast Greenway. He rode from New York to DC, and he suggested that as something that would be a very reasonable challenge. And I'd say everything really clicked into place after that. I have lots of friends on the East Coast because I went to school there, and I lived in the DC area just like you. And that is a really nice middle point between Maine and Florida. So if I were way behind schedule, I could just stop there and call it, a great partway finished trip. Yeah, and then it would be on the coast the whole way. So honestly, not too much elevation gain. And I was going to be around civilization. I think the Greenway goes through 450 communities. And so there would be lots of help whenever I needed it. So yeah, East Coast Greenway was the way to go.
How much prep work did you do going into it? I mean, I know you used Ride with GPS, you had mentioned in some your website or something like that. So, but how deep into it did you get to kind of know what you were facing?
Yeah. I think I'm a bit of a planner. So I started out first using the Greenway's map tool. I think if you go to greenway.org, you can find their pretty comprehensive map tool that shows all like the entire route with notices about road closures or anything hazardous to keep an eye out for. So I started out with that, and then I mapped the entire route on Ride with GPS so that I would have something guiding me as I was biking. And on parts that I was nervous about, I went on Google Maps and just like clicked through Street View the entire way through so that I would have this idea of what the roads look like.
You and I are exactly the same. This is a
Yeah.
planner podcast and a
Yep.
use Google Earth and Google Maps to do that. Also, this
Yep.
is a Wilcox appreciation podcast as well. So
Mhm.
you are definitely in the right place.
Oh,
So
yeah.
the thing that triggered all of this was what you described as a quarter life crisis, which I think is fascinating. And I definitely went through something like that, but didn't have a name for it. So I appreciate that there's a name for it. Did the ride help that, or did it prompt more introspection about where you're at? I'm curious whether it was ultimately successful or not in that
Yeah,
element.
totally. So I was 24, almost 25 when I did the bike trip. And so that's why I called it a quarter life crisis. And looking back now, I think like I thought I was getting so old, but of course anybody will be like, no, you're only 25. Like that's not very old at all. But I was at this stage in my life where I had worked for a few years. I graduated school, but I had no idea what I wanted my life to look like in the next 5 years or the next 10 years. And I didn't really know what I was working towards professionally, personally, interpersonally. Yeah, basically, I think I was just in a place in my life where I was working, but I didn't know where I wanted to go. So I don't know if my bike trip really answered any of those questions, but when you're bike touring or riding your bike for, I think it was for me like 10 to 12 hours a day, that's a lot of time alone, especially when, like you do many solo trips, and this for me was a solo trip. I there wasn't too much time for like critical thinking because I'm paying attention to what's going on around me and enjoying the scenery and everything. But I think I learned a lot about myself and what makes me tick and what makes me feel comfortable. I'm already quite introverted, so I was really excited to just be alone all day. But I think I learned how much I can accomplish when I'm put in scenarios that I never would have imagined myself in. Like, I think we're always more capable than we think we are, but that doesn't really come out until we're placed in those scenarios. And then that's when you transform into like your most capable self. So anyways, the bike trip made me realize like who I am, what makes me work, and like that I am capable of doing like answering all these unknown questions when they come. And it's important to just take things one step or one pedal at a time. Yeah,
Exactly.
so I think it was less of an answering your quarter life crisis and more um being introspective and sure of myself.
I'm a terrible meditator, and
Yeah,
the only place where I can approach what I think is good meditation is when I'm on the bike and
Mhm.
alone in my thoughts on a long ride. So that
Totally.
totally jives. So one thing I really appreciate about your film, perhaps the most, is that it did a great job of showing the lows as much as the highs. Sometimes when I look back on my tours, I look back on them as more of a type 2 fun, which I think we all kind of experience on these types of things. How do you assess your lows now? And does anyone really stand out that maybe you reassess now compared to what it was like in the moment?
Yeah, it's something actually when I listened to your podcast. I totally identified with, where when you're in the moment, you're like, oh my gosh, it's hailing in LA right now. Like, what is this? This is crazy. And I think I got to the point where whenever something happened, I was just like, oh, of course this is happening. But I approached it with like equal parts disbelief and acceptance that resulted in like a smile on my face. So definitely a type 2 fun. I think the real only low was the first low I had. And then after that, it was like, you know, this is just part of bike packing and bike touring. This is just part of the experience. So the first low and the only like real low when I look back and I'm like, I do not want to do that again, was the first time it rained. So I, like, as a bike commuter, it's easier to avoid rain or just decide to take public transportation and not bike. But for me, I couldn't take any break days because of my aggressive schedule. And when it rained, I was still biking. So first day was just outside of Boston. It started drizzling early. I tried to start so early so that I would miss the rain. I started biking at 3:30 or 4 in the morning, but it still hit like pretty hard downpour. And then my brakes stopped working. I think I ran over a hole or something happened. But then my brakes, which are these hydraulic brakes that I did not know how to adjust. And I still like, I don't know if anybody carries the right equipment to fix hydraulic brakes when they are doing long biking trips, but my brakes stopped working. There was really nothing I could do about it. I rolled into a fast food chain and loitered for long enough that they kicked me out, and I was crying. There were no Ubers to pick me up because it was just remote enough outside of Boston that like there were no Ubers or Lyfts in the area. So I ended up having to walk my bike 20 miles to the nearest bike shop. And it wasn't like walking the whole time. It'd be like walk up the hills and then slowly roll down wherever it was safe to roll down. But I think that was the really only like actually low day. And then everything else, like there was a day it was raining in Wilmington in the Carolinas, and it was raining so hard that whenever the cars passed by me, and they knew this was happening, so they gave me as much space as possible, but whenever they drove past me, their wheels would spray so much water over me that it was like dumping a bucket each time. And it got to the point where I was just like, I don't even need my rain jacket anymore. We're just going to embrace this wet, and then we'll dry off with one of those hand dryers later. But
There is
yeah.
a point where you can't get any more wet and you may as well
Yep.
just cycle through it.
Yeah.
That's what I've had that more times than I can count. Absolutely.
Right.
So I think the brake thing was one of the bigger mechanicals, at least that I am aware of. I think you had at least one other, if memory serves. Do you have any takeaways from those mechanicals? Because I mean, again, we keep using the term aggressive schedule here. That must have thrown you off. I mean, you had some I mean, you had more than 100 miles on several days in there, and these mechanicals must have just added more of those to you. Like, you talk about your brakes, would you consider going to something, a simpler rim brake or something like that? What are your takeaways from those types of mechanicals?
Yeah, definitely go simpler because rim brakes are pretty easy to adjust and diagnose issues. I actually, when I rolled my bike to the bike shop, they couldn't figure out what was wrong with my hydraulic brakes and switched them out for mechanical brakes, which at least I know how to adjust. I think like for any future trip, I sure hope everybody approaches bike touring with more knowledge than I had. I could do two things. I could tighten and loosen things, and I could fix a flat. And the second half of the trip, I encountered enough flat tires that I could, from getting off the bike to getting back on the bike, I could fix the flat in 15 minutes. And I thought that was pretty good. But I had a bike multi-tool, and I only knew how to use the hex wrench and the flat screwdriver to clean off like the grime and stuff from the cassette. But I think for future trips, I would definitely prefer a more bike touring specific bike, and at least know how to adjust derailleurs and maybe do like more like more brake specific adjustments, because I think whenever I felt something sticky with the shifting, I would turn those tubes and just hope that something good would happen, and just remember how much I turned. So if it was worse, then I'd turn it back. Um, but yeah, I was pretty lucky with the trip because I didn't really run into too many issues. It was just the brakes that one day outside of Boston, and then a second day where I had a flat tire, but then my bike pump also broke. So I
Of course,
tried
right?
it again. Yeah, you can't really do too much about that.
Um, that's wild. By the way, cleaning your cassette, you're already like 3 steps past me, because I mean, I am famous for not doing any chain or cassette maintenance on my tours
Oh,
for whatever
yeah.
reason. But being the monarch of the barrel adjuster, that is a good place to be. That's
Yep.
all I have to say about that.
The barrel
Um,
adjuster. I didn't even know
yes,
the name for it. That's how clueless I was.
I still don't even know what a top tube is. Come on.
Yeah.
Uh, One of the things in your film that struck me, and it really got me thinking, was talking about how you learned to eat while you were riding. And in the film, and again, everybody go check out this short film. It's so good. You're reaching into a little baggie that looked like frosted mini wheats, and that immediately made me go, "Oh my God, that is so the right way to go." Was that really one of your solutions for you? And what else did you learn? Like, more specifically, what did you learn about feeding yourself while you were riding? Because it really felt like, the way you described that was a huge turning point for just being able to bang out these miles.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's so funny, that little clip of me reaching to the bag. So I had to hold my phone with my right hand and then reach into the bag with my left hand. And so about 5 seconds after I filmed that moment, I fell off my bike
Of course.
because nothing was holding the handlebars. And I guess I didn't realize how important it is to balance the weight on your bike so you don't just fall off. But that was the only time I fell off my bike the entire trip. Had no other bike
People
crashes.
ask me why I don't do more video. That is why I don't
Yeah,
do
that
more
is why
video.
it's hard. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think maybe some people have a better like helmet, GoPro setup, but anyways, I learned how to fuel myself. So I biked an average of a little over 100 miles every day, and that meant that I would need to have a like a consistent source of fuel throughout the entire time. And I think at the beginning of the trip, the first week or so, my my body's reserves just kept me going, so I could just eat whatever I want. And in my head, I just thought quantity is all I'm looking for. Just like make sure you get enough calories. And then near the midpoint, so maybe about 2 weeks in, my body started just being hungry all the time. And I stayed with someone, a warm showers host. So, for those who don't know, warm showers is a great resource for finding wonderful places to stay and meeting great people, which I think makes any trip more meaningful. But I learned about properly fueling myself when I was on the bike. So that meant for breakfast, I would try to have overnight oats and a banana. So some sort of complex carbs that would take a while to digest and keep me more full throughout the day. And then while I'm on the bike, I had three categories of food. So one was healthy food, which was anything with potassium to keep me from bonking, I think is the term.
Yeah.
And then food that I would say is quote, quote, not unhealthy, which would be the frosted mini wheats that have some sort of substance
Yeah.
to them, but also are tasty. I ate a lot of Pop Tarts, Cliff Bars whenever I like sat down and took a break. Had some Gatorade, and I also had what I would admit is unhealthy, but very morale boosting snacks. So those would be gummies whenever I needed like a sugar boost before a hill or something. So I think knowing how to fuel smartly and fuel consistently, and then for dinner, making sure I got plenty of protein and veggies and carbs to make sure, like, yes, I'm burning so many calories that I can basically eat whatever I want, but still be smart about like staying properly fueled.
Yeah. Yeah. And that end of the day is so important too, because it resets your glycogen for the morning. So it's just like dinner is so important on a bike tour. And I don't think I talk about that nearly enough. But
Yeah.
yeah, okay, that's cool. I'm glad to hear it. I love the not unhealthy, because I talk about stealth camping sometimes, about some
Mhm.
stuff being not illegal.
Mhm.
So I totally get that.
Yep.
So you talked a little bit about your bike and that maybe you'd reconsider the bike that you rode, but so what did you ride, and what would you characterize as a bike that would be, I don't know, maybe would better be the right word, for a trip of this type?
Yeah, for sure. I remember watching a bike video by probably Ryan Van Duzer, who said something along the lines of the best bike is the bike you have. And my bike was a Fuji Sportif sport bike. So it's not like a gravel bike or a bike touring bike, but its frame is kind of like geared towards endurance biking. It's more of a comfortable ride. It's not like an aggressive, fast road bike. The geometry is more comfortable. I don't really know the right terms to describe this,
Like a
but the front
cyclocross
is
bike or
higher up.
something?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So this is the first road bike I've ever owned. So, and the only one I've ever owned. I still ride the same bike. It's still going strong, which probably speaks a lot to how well it's built. So I can't really complain, but I do know that I was lucky in purchasing this bike, that it had a pretty favorable gear ratio for climbing hills, which I didn't know at the time. But when my gears, I had to change out the cassette after the trip, and the only ones available were ones that were in narrower range, probably more suited for just like fast road biking. And hills are so much harder now. So I think if I will certainly do another longer bike trip in the future, but I would probably either switch out the cassette or use a proper bike touring bike next
That's
time.
smart. Yeah. I did my first tour on a narrow range gear set and was just wondering why I was struggling so bad. And
Yeah.
the mechanic on that organized tour was just like, my dude, this is not a good set for you.
Yeah, right?
So, um, do you, I want to hit two things, but like the first thing I want to do is, it sounds like you're interested in doing another tour at some point. Do you have one in mind? And are you looking at something as big and dynamic as that? Or are you looking at maybe like a smaller ride? I mean, we have the C&O in our backyard, I'm here to say.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've done maybe 40, 50 miles of this C&O.
Okay.
But the C&O Gap Trail from here in DC to Pittsburgh is something that's definitely on my US bucket list. I think the ultimate goal is get good enough at gravel riding that I can do the Tour Divide. There are a few other trips. Like I think the East Coast Greenway, seeing this huge slice of the US, like in Maine, you get the pine trees, and then all the way down to Florida, you get the palm trees. And
Right.
in Maine, you get the Maine lobster roll, and then Florida, you get the Key West lobster roll. And like seeing all like the different cultures and different landscapes between these two extremes of the US East, that made me realize that, hey, it'd be really cool to do cross country from DC to California or Oregon. I think there's already a couple of like pretty
Yeah.
well built out systems for that. I do have a kind of crazy idea that I am considering. If I go abroad, I would love to do the Tour de France and follow one of the women's routes. They've started like reinstating the Tour de France Femme, which is like the women's version. And I would love to bike that very, very slowly. And obviously not in like 100+ miles a day, which they do, but yeah, at my own pace.
Yeah, those hills are real deal. Any of the Tour de France
Oh yeah.
routes are. I mean, it is just insane seeing the elevation gain in those. It's nuts, but that is a great goal. You are now a board trustee. I guess they hand out board trustee seats for anybody who rides the East Coast Greenway, it seems. No, I'm kidding. But you are a board trustee, which is pretty cool. And this lets me put on my nonprofit lawyer hat on, which is unusual on this podcast. What's your experience been like serving in that role? And if it's cool to share, what's the organization aiming at in the short and long term to support the Greenway?
Yeah, for sure. So I actually joined the board in January this year, so just a few months ago. And I would say I'm more at the beginning of my journey towards navigating what it's like working in the like bike advocacy or nonprofit space. But I have my experience so far. Actually, I'm in North Carolina right now, just having finished going to our annual board meeting in Durham, North Carolina, which is where the Greenway's headquarters are. And I have learned a lot from like speaking with the board members and learning like what goes into making the Greenway a reality. The board is made up of lawyers, urban planners, designers. There are so many people involved in the board, and the staff is incredible too, and have so much on the ground knowledge of the work that goes into advocacy and awareness, and of course, building the Greenway. So, in terms of priorities, so when I rode the Greenway, there was, I think, a little less or around a third of the Greenway completed. And by completed, I mean their goal is to make the entire route from Calais, Maine to Key West, Florida, completely off-road and protected.
Mm.
And right now they're, I think, 36% done, and it's growing every year. And we're at a point in time where we're like infrastructure in the US is something that is pretty big right now, and the Greenway could really take off. Like this could all be done in 10 years. But we want to capitalize that, and we also want to partner with the communities that the Greenway runs through. So something that I realized when I biked the Greenway was we go through a lot of communities, but many people don't even know that the Greenway runs through their backyard. Like I'm sure even in DC, like people will know about the Mount Vernon Trail, but they won't realize that this trail is part of a long connected series of routes that could take them anywhere. DC actually is almost fully complete. I think there's just like a little less than a mile that's still on road, but it's probably just through like neighborhoods and
Yeah.
stuff.
And it's pretty, we've got signage in DC for it too, don't
Oh
we?
yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
Look out
awesome.
for that. Yeah. Yeah. We've got, it's a little sign. If you go through the mall, I think you'll see a couple there too.
Yeah.
Yeah. The little East Coast Greenway vertical signs.
Yeah. That's great for raising awareness. And that's something I think that the folks with the Gap did a really good job of, because the Greenway, like the Gap, is a series of connections in these different community trails in a lot of ways, and sort of raising that awareness, saying, hey, when you ride this, you're riding a trail that includes all the way up to Maine and all the way down to Key West. I think that that can really, I don't know, spark some imagination with folks. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And in places like North Carolina has made this year the year of the trail. And so they have lots of events and programming and outreach and advocacy for even diversity and inclusion efforts to make everybody aware of the opportunities they have with trails. So you don't even have to be a biker. You could just be, oh, I want to take a walk as my after dinner activity. Where can I go? So I think, well, I know these outreach and community partnerships are a big priority for the Greenway Alliance. And then doing more storytelling and raising awareness through that. Like my bike trip is just one story, but someone named Shan actually just ultra marathon the whole thing. He ran the whole Greenway and did 40 miles every single day and took like 2 break days. And then
Wow.
a guy named Avery just unicycled the Greenway. So there are just so many cool people doing great things. And like, it doesn't have to be a story that goes viral, but I feel like sharing all these stories of the Greenway and like how it can change people's lives or how it can just be a part of someone's lives is a big priority that the Greenway is pushing to, in addition to the primary goal of making this whole thing off-road.
That's really amazing. And I did not know that was a goal for the East Coast Greenway. I'm super excited about that. Check that out at greenway.org. So if you are considering a big tour and all you hear about me is yak about the West Coast, hey, there is an East Coast option for you too. I'm definitely going to take a look at it. Regina, thank you so much for joining. Is there any last kind of takeaway that you want to kind of like put out into the universe, or at least the small section of the universe that is the listenership of the Pedalshift project?
A small but mighty universe. Yeah, I think like I'm certainly not the most experienced person in the world, but I got out there and had a blast. And I'm sure there are folks who listen to this podcast who haven't quite gotten into biking yet, but enjoy thinking about it and like perusing articles. And I I find biking to be totally what you make of it. And just putting yourself out there and trying and maybe failing, but still trying can be an amazing life-changing experience. So everybody ride the Greenway, ride outside, just get outside. It's a great time. Type 2 fun, but a great time.
Can't say it any better than that. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tim.